In the spring of 1948, over 530 Palestinian towns and villages existed. By the end of that year, more than 400 of them were gone, depopulated, demolished, or renamed. The question that has never been fully settled is whether this was the chaos of war or the execution of a plan. The answer matters more than most people realize, because it determines whether what happened to Palestinians in 1948 was a tragedy or a crime. And those are not the same thing. The word used by Palestinians for what happened is al-Nakba, the catastrophe. Between late 1947 and 1949, approximately 700,000 Palestinians, roughly half the Arab population of Mandatory Palestine, fled or were expelled from their homes. They were never allowed to return. The State of Israel was declared on May 14, 1948, and the architecture of that state was built, in significant part, on the erasure of what had been there before. For decades, the dominant Israeli narrative held that the Palestinians left voluntarily, fleeing in anticipation of a war their own leaders started, driven out by panic rather than force. That version has not survived the archival record. When Israeli state archives were partially declassified in the 1980s, historians, including Israeli ones, found something more deliberate. The document at the center of this is Plan Dalet, drawn up by the Haganah in March 1948. Plan Dalet, or Plan D, was a military strategy whose text explicitly included provisions for the destruction of villages and the expulsion of populations. Under what conditions, and with what intent, historians continue to dispute. Historian Ilan Pappé, working from Israeli military archives, argues it constituted a blueprint for ethnic cleansing. Israeli historian Benny Morris, who reached similar archival conclusions, describes it more clinically as a military directive that produced, predictably, mass expulsion. The distinction between those two interpretations is itself revealing. Morris documented over 30 massacre sites from that period. The most consequential was Deir Yassin on April 9, 1948, where fighters from the Irgun and Lehi killed between 100 and 120 Palestinian villagers, including women and children. The killings were not incidental to combat. They were carried out after the village had been partially subdued. News of Deir Yassin spread rapidly through Palestinian communities, and the terror it generated accelerated the flight of civilians from other villages, which is precisely what terror is designed to do. And one of those civilians could have been any farmer from the village of Saffuriyya in the Galilee, a real place with real people, none of whom had a role in the fighting. When Israeli military forces moved through the Galilee in July 1948 during Operation Dekel, Saffuriyya was depopulated in a single day. Its residents joined the column of tens of thousands moving toward Lebanon. They carried what they could. They believed, as most Palestinians did, that they would return within weeks. They were still waiting decades later, and Saffuriyya no longer exists. A Jewish community called Tzipori was established on the site. The original village structures were demolished or absorbed. The olive groves remained, tended now by different hands. Here is what makes the scale genuinely difficult to hold. Saffuriyya was not unusual. According to Palestinian historian Walid Khalidi's exhaustive survey, All That Remains, published in 1992, 418 Palestinian villages were depopulated during 1948. Of those, approximately 292 were completely destroyed. The physical erasure was methodical, structures bulldozed, rubble cleared, trees in some cases uprooted. In other cases, the buildings were repurposed. In all cases, the people were gone. The mechanisms that kept them out were as deliberate as the mechanisms that drove them out. The Israeli Absentee Property Law, passed in 1950, classified any Palestinian who had left their home, whether expelled at gunpoint or fled under bombardment, as an absentee. Their property was transferred to a state custodian and then, systematically, to Jewish ownership. The law did not distinguish between a man who had joined an armed militia and a grandmother who had fled a massacre. Absence was the only criterion. Property, once reclassified, was essentially unrecoverable. The right of return, enshrined in United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194, passed in December 1948, was never implemented. The resolution stated that Palestinian refugees wishing to return to their homes should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. Israel rejected the resolution's application to its own borders. The refugees and their descendants, now numbering approximately 6 million according to UNRWA registration, constitute one of the longest-running and largest protracted refugee populations in recorded history. The forensic question, was this planned, has shifted decisively among professional historians. The debate has not disappeared, but its center has moved. The old denialist position that none of this was deliberate has not survived the archives. Benny Morris, who cannot be dismissed as an anti-Israel polemicist, concluded in his landmark 1988 work, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, that expulsions were widespread, often ordered at the military command level, and that the leadership of the emerging Israeli state was aware of and in many cases directed what was happening. He later revised his view to suggest the expulsions were, in his words, inevitable and in some sense justified, given the context, a position that sparked its own controversy, but he did not revise the factual record. What the archival evidence shows is a state in formation, making deliberate choices about who would be permitted to remain within its borders and who would not, and then constructing legal and physical infrastructure to make those choices permanent. The demolition of villages was not, in the main, an incidental side effect of war. The archival record shows deliberate decisions made at the command level, even if historians continue to dispute how far a single coordinating policy directed each case. The Absentee Property Law was not a temporary emergency measure. The refusal to implement Resolution 194 was not an oversight. Each step locked the previous one in place, converting a military outcome into a permanent demographic fact. 700,000 people lost their homes in a single year. The Nakba did not end in 1948. It became a legal and administrative condition, one that has been maintained, reinforced, and, in some areas, extended for more than 75 years. Understanding it as a historical event with a beginning and an end is exactly the misreading that its architects depended upon. If this episode made you think differently, subscribe. New episodes every week. And if you want to go deeper, there's more waiting for you.